just tell you guys why I decided to do this series of talks. There's been a lot of talk nationally, this discussion of Black Lives Matter since the incident in Ferguson, Missouri last year with Michael Brown. And so I've been listening to a lot of the national dialogue, some local stuff in Milwaukee, a lot of people talking about Black Lives Matter. And what I found lacking was a historical context for it. And so I decided to look into the matter and do a series of talks related to it. And so what I've done is I've put together a series of 4 presentations related to this idea of, do Black Lives Matter? And so they're going to cover a series of topics, and we're putting it in historical context by looking at the history of legal and extra-legal violence against blacks, pseudo-scientific justifications for devaluing the lives of blacks, lynchings, race riots, a history of American policing of blacks, scientific and medical experimentation on blacks, and the psychological impacts of this devaluation on black lives, how it impacts the lives of black people, as well as looking at some very important court decisions that have led to this devaluation of black lives in America. So this session tonight, we're actually going to be looking kind of a big picture frame. We're going to be looking at the beginning, the arrival of the first Africans in what will become the United States in 1619. We're going to trace some of the events that have cemented the devaluation of black lives within the collective memory of America. These things that we've learned, these ugly events that we learned about in American history, but I want to dig into them a little bit deeper, some of them, and then look very closely at the psychological damage done to blacks over this period of time, and look really at how it leads to self-devaluation, self-hatred, and personal violence, intrapersonal violence within the black community. So, just a few words on words. I'm one of these people, I don't really care for the term African American. It's too hard to say for me. Black just comes off my lips a little bit easier, so I prefer the term black, but I go back and forth. And instead of describing the Africans who were enslaved as slaves, because to me that's just an object. A slave is an object, so I try to humanize them, give them their humanity back by calling them enslaved Africans. So that's the term that I prefer to use. Unless it's a historical document that I'm pointing to specifically that uses that word, I typically refer to them as enslaved Africans instead. And I'm going to talk in generalities. It's very hard to get very specific when you're talking about big topics like this. So we're going to kind of paint with a broad brush to a certain extent, but we're going to look at a few things in a more specific way though. So one of the things I like to do that I've learned recently that works is to have a Q&A session at the end. And I've learned that the best way to do those is to give people the opportunity to write their questions down as I'm doing the presentation, because something may pop in your mind, you may forget about it later. So if you guys would like to grab some cards, and I have some pens here. If any questions pop in your minds, just feel free to write those down, and I'll collect those later and do my best to answer as many of those as I can. So that's kind of the way the Q&A will work. Okay. All right, so everyone, all right.
There's more cards if you...
Okay, it looks like we're all set with that. Okay. All right, so this topic, Black Lives Matter, you know, the statement that's been made around the country, Black Lives Matter. And so I looked at it and I said, well, you really shouldn't have to say that. I mean, that should be like a no-brainer. Of course Black Lives Matter. But when you look at it historically, you have to ask the question, do Black Lives matter? And so we're going to look at the history of blacks in the country and see if we can answer that question. Do Black Lives matter?
Freedom is the right to share fully and equally in American society. To vote, to hold a job, to enter a public place, to go to school. It is the right to be treated in in every part of our national life as a person equal in dignity and promise to all others. But freedom is not enough. You do not wipe away the scars of centuries by saying now, you are free to go where you want and do as you desire and choose the leaders you please. You do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bringing up to the starting line of a race, and then say, you are free to compete with all the others. And still justly believe that you have been completely fair. Thus, it is not enough just to open the gates of opportunity. All our citizens must have the ability to walk through those gates. And this is the next and the more profound stage of the battle for civil rights. We seek not just freedom, but opportunity. We seek not just legal equity, but human ability. Not just equality as a right and a theory, but equality as a fact and equality as a result.
So those are famous words spoken by President Johnson. Actually, exactly 4 months before I was born, in a little town in Mississippi, he spoke those words. And we're still trying to live up to those standards that he talked about. So let's go back to the beginning of the first African people to arrive in what would eventually become the United States of America. They arrived, a group of 20 or so arrived on a Dutch slaving ship that had run low on provisions. They had actually run out of food and they were looking for food, so they landed in Jamestown and they actually sold those 20 or so Africans for provisions so they could have food to continue their journey. And so most historians, if you look at history books, they'll describe those Africans as indentured servants, but I refuse to call them that, because every indentured servant that came to the United States signed a contract in some place in Europe, in France, England, wherever. They signed a contract, and that contract would provide them with free travel to the New World, and they'd have to work that off, work for someone for 4 to 7 years to pay that debt. There's not a single African that signed an indenture contract. So I don't care what the historians say, I don't care what the records from Jamestown say they were, I refuse to call them indentured servants because they came over on a slaving ship. So if we look, legal slavery began very early on in the English colonies. Massachusetts was the first colony to provide a law that mandated slavery in 1641, followed by Connecticut, Virginia, Maryland. You see New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire. Most people are unaware that those states had slavery on the books. All of the original 13 colonies, slavery was legal in those places for an extended period of time. We typically think of slavery, though, just as a Southern institution, but it became a part of the devaluation of African lives very early on, and it spread from colony to colony. So these are a couple laws from Virginia. One was in 1669, and this to me is really letting you know how America felt very early on, before America was even thought about, how these African people would be treated. There was an act that became law there that said the casual killing of slaves is, if an enslaved African dies while resisting his master, the act will not be presumed to have occurred with prepense malice. So you basically were giving people permission to kill these African men, women, and children without any penalty. You're giving them permission. You're saying it's legally okay to take their lives, and you don't have to worry about suffering any penalty as a result. 3 years later, it became legal to wound or kill an enslaved African who resists arrest. So the police were given permission to kill any African man, woman, or child who resisted arrest. It was a law that was written. And if they did, they had to provide compensation to the owner of that African man, woman, or child that they had killed. So you basically giving them permission to kill Africans, anyone who owns one, and you're giving the police permission to kill them, and no one will go to jail as a result of killing these Africans. So that's the ultimate way to devalue the lives of people. So we just celebrated the 4th of July. Celebrated the Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson. Most of us aren't aware of this other document he wrote 5 years later called Notes on the State of Virginia. And he talked about a little bit of everything with Virginia. He talked about the birds that were there, different animals, different plants. But he also talked about the people there. And one of the statements that he made, he compared blacks to whites. And he said this: "I advance it therefore as a suspicion only that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowments both of body and mind." So he's telling everyone, and he was one of the first really important people in America to make this statement, saying that black people were inferior to whites. Other people may have felt that way, but he was the first really important dignitary in America to actually make that known publicly. And that was a very popular book. I've read parts of it, and I tell you, if you have trouble sleeping, pick up a copy of it, and you're going to fall asleep very quickly. But it's some very interesting things in it that he talked about. So let's look at a few slave codes that were developed around the country. One of the interesting things about these blacks, they became a commodity. They weren't just someone that you purchased just to have working for you. They actually served as a commodity, just as any other commodity. And you could have them as a reward in a raffle. And you see here there's a poster talking about a raffle that was going to take place. You could use them to wager if you were gambling, playing poker. You could offer them as security for loans. You go to the bank, you use them as collateral to get a loan. In addition to that, they could be transferred as gifts from one person to another, and they could also be transferred through wills. In fact, as I was tracing my family's history, I was fortunate enough to receive a copy of the will of the man who owned my family in Mississippi, and I saw in this will that he was giving away my family members on the day that he died. He said this one is going to go that way and this one is going to go that way. So they were much more than just laborers. Some more codes. Obviously, this is very important. Blacks were held incompetent as witnesses in legal cases involving whites. And there's kind of a parallel to that as we've looked at the criminal justice system in detail over the course of a number of years. One of the things that I find very common, especially in cases that we don't really hear much about, is that most of the juries, when there's a black defendant, most of the juries are all white or very close to being all white. The prosecutor has the right to dismiss certain jurors based on just, I don't want that person on the jury. Doesn't have to give any reason. And so very often blacks are dismissed. And so that's why I hear a lot of black people say that, it's supposed to be a jury of my peers, but none of the people look like me. And so this was the case way back in the day during the days of enslavement, and it's still to a certain extent the case as well today. The education of enslaved Africans was strictly prohibited. Anyone who operated a school or taught them to read or write could face jail and fine, and they could not assemble without a white person present. Imagine that. They could not assemble without a white person being present. So they were very closely controlled because their lives were not valuable. One of the other really important aspects, this slave code said that marriages between enslaved Africans, it's not legally binding. You can get married, but legally it doesn't make a difference. And so this person is free to split up families, sell the mother that way, the father that way, the children, whatever. And this happened very, very often. People were sold numerous times. We watch movies about slavery, documentaries and things, and they very rarely tell you that a lot of Africans were sold a number of times, even here in the United States. For instance, this is kind of the way it would work. Say Charleston, South Carolina was one of the places where a majority of the Africans arrived in the United States. I think it was the largest port outside of New Orleans for the arrival of Africans. And so And what you found is that people would come there, these slave traders, they would come and they would purchase 50 Africans. And so they would go out through the countryside, throughout South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, and they would sell them 1 here, 2 there, 3 there, so on and so forth. And so they would be sold multiple times during the course of their lives. A few more. If an enslaved African is found guilty of arson or the rape of a white woman or conspiracy to rebel, they were going to be put to death automatically. Since the enslaved African woman was considered chattel, she was just property. She could be treated any way that the person who owned her wanted to, and there was no such thing as rape of a black woman or girl. There were no laws that protected them in that respect. And so if someone did sexually assault them, the only charge they would have to face would be trespassing against the property of some individual that owned that person. I don't know if you guys have seen the movie 12 Years a Slave, but these laws impacted free blacks as well. They were banned from possessing firearms. They couldn't even preach. It was against the law for these free blacks. And there were, at the 1860 census, I believe there were about 1.5 million free blacks living in the South. Many of them had been given their freedom years earlier. Some of them had actually purchased their freedom by saving money. And so if you went out of state, let's just say you were in Mississippi and you went to, I don't know, Illinois to get an education, you weren't allowed to come back to Mississippi. It was against the law as a free black person. And so these codes kept the black people in bondage. And since you could not testify in court, if you were kidnapped, you couldn't go to court and say, this person kidnapped me. I lived in Maryland, they kidnapped me and took me to Kentucky. You couldn't testify on your behalf. Therefore, there was no way you could really gain your freedom. And if you guys remember in the movie 12 Years a Slave, that's exactly what happened to him. It took 12 years before someone actually came and identified him as a free person. He gained his freedom that way. This is one of the more interesting documents, I believe, in the entire history of the United States of America. The Constitution of the state of Indiana in 1851 stated that no Negro or mulatto shall come into or settle in the state after the adoption of this Constitution. No black people are welcome to come into the state. Imagine that. And if you did, and you came in and you decided to work for someone, you signed a contract, that contract would be null and void. And the person that signed the contract with you would have to pay a fine, and this fine would be put into the big pot, and they would use this pot to try to fund colonization of blacks outside of the United States of America. So Indiana, very early on, was inhospitable to black people. There's a famous Supreme Court case, which I'll talk about in more detail actually on Wednesday. It's called the Dred Scott case. And one of the more interesting things about this case is the opinion that the court offered at the end. He was trying to gain his freedom because he had been taken from a slave state to Illinois, which is a free state, Wisconsin, which is a free sate. And so he felt that, well, I'm in a free state, I should be given my freedom. And he went through, I believe, 14 years worth of court cases before it finally got to the U.S. Supreme Court, which ruled against him because they said you're not a citizen because you can't become a citizen because you're a black person, and you can't become a citizen, therefore you are not allowed to sue in federal court. So they threw the case out. But during the course of talking about how they adjudicated it, one of the things that the Chief Justice said was that he looked back at how blacks were treated in the Declaration of Independence, and he said these famous words: they had for more than a century before been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. The Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. This is what the Supreme Court said in the Dred Scott case. So let's look at a famous American novel where I think that this is just a classic example of the devaluation of blacks and how whites looked at blacks as not valuable at all. So In chapter 32 of the book, Aunt Sally, whose nephew is Tom, shows a total disregard for the lives of black people. And so when Huck, pretending to be Tom, tries to explain why he has been delayed getting back to the house, he explains that a steamboat engine was damaged and the cylinder head blew up. And so this is the conversation. But before I get to that, interestingly enough, I found that in 1955, CBS produced a made-for-TV movie about the book. And they made sure, this is just so crazy, they made sure that they didn't talk about slavery at all. And they made sure that the one character, the main character in the book who was black, was actually a white person in the made-for-TV movie. So they tried to avoid the reality of the book, but this is one of the poignant moments in the book. And he says to Aunt Sally, and I'm not going to even try to say it the way he said it, but he's telling him that we blow the cylinder head. And she says, "Good gracious, is anybody hurt?" And he says, "No, ma'am, killed a nigger." And she says, "Well, it's lucky, because sometimes people do get hurt." And then she goes on to tell the story about a white guy who was killed in a similar way, and just completely ignored the fact that this black man had been killed. And so that's a complete, utter example of the devaluation of black people in the eyes of whites. So we've all heard of Jim Crow. You know, there's a lot of historians that have written about it. Nobody can really say specifically why this particular character became the name for these laws and customs, but it began to immerse itself in Americana in the 1870s with these minstrel shows, and eventually in the 1890s these laws began to shift how blacks were treated throughout the country. So one of the things that became very paramount became these different caricatures of black people. And they really invested a great deal of effort in letting people know that this is how we should see black people. And so what happened, it cemented images of blacks in the minds of Americans that are still very well known today. You guys will see as we go through these caricatures, you'll recognize many of them right away. In many ways, they are images that allow people to prejudge black people, to prejudge them. And although blacks suffer extreme levels of segregation, whites are the most segregated people in the country. Whites are more likely to live in a community that's all of one racial group more so than any other group in the country. And so a lot of whites have little to no contact with blacks, and what they base their interactions with blacks on are these stereotypes that they've seen over and over and over. And so I've gotten these descriptions and some of the images from the Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia at Ferris State University in Michigan. So let's look at first the Brute caricature. That's a picture of Iron Mike Tyson. So this caricature portrays black men as innately savage, animalistic, criminal, a fiend, sociopath, antisocial, a menace, predators. And we hear these terms over and over and over again as they're describing blacks. I can remember very, very clearly the Central Park jogger case in New York many, many years ago, and the big headlines in the New York papers called these young boys who eventually were found to be completely innocent of many charges. They called them all of these different terms using animal terms. And I can remember very clearly with the Mike Brown case, the officer who shot Mike Brown, one of the terms that he used to describe Mike Brown, he said that he looked like a demon. And so that's part of this caricature of blacks as brutes. The Mandingo character, this stereotype of black men being hypersexual and claiming that this hypersexuality leads them to randomly, indiscriminately rape white women. And it was used as a rationalization for the lynching of hundreds and hundreds of blacks over the years. The Pickaninny caricature were these images of black children who were looked at as child coons. They had big bulging eyes, red lips, wide mouths. They often ate watermelon. They were nameless and shiftless, and they loved eating fried chicken. In fact, my wife does mammography for a living, and she had a patient that came in, this was several years ago, and it was an older white woman in her mid-80s, I believe, and she said the woman just just fell in love with her when she saw her. She said, "Oh, you just look just like my little pickaninny I had when I was a kid." And she was just going on and on and on. And she thought it was a compliment to my wife. Obviously, my wife was like, this woman must be crazy. But, she was going to be nice because it was an older woman. She's very respectful. But she was just shocked that this woman would go on and on and on and call her a little pickaninny. So that's something that's very fresh in the minds of that particular woman. The Tom caricature was played extremely well, a little bit too well, I think, by Samuel Jackson in Django Unchained. It's like, man, dude, you're a really great actor, or I don't know. But anyway, so this caricature portrays black men, particularly older black men, as these faithful, happily submissive servants who are always smiling, wide-eyed, very, very dark-skinned. They're docile. They're non-threatening to white people. They're often old, physically weak, and very psychologically dependent on whites for approval. And so if you ever see that movie, Django Unchained, you'll see a perfect example of that. I think he did an outstanding job playing that character. I don't know how he did it. I couldn't have done it. The Sapphire character. You probably never heard the term Sapphire, but I'm sure you're familiar with this term of the angry black woman. And so this caricature portrays black women as rude, loud, malicious, stubborn, overbearing, and has been popularized in movies and television time and time again. She's always nagging somebody, usually some black man, with these irrational states of anger and indignation. She's got her hand on her hips and she's waving her finger, and she's very mean-spirited and abusive. This is very common. I see it in movies all the time. So that's something that's been around for a very long time. Most of these caricatures of blacks that we're talking about actually came about during the days of slavery or shortly after slavery. So they've been with us for a very, very long time. And even though they've been challenged, they just keep hanging on. They won't go away. The Jezebel caricature portrays black women as lascivious, seductive, alluring, exotic, tempting, lewd, and they look. There's this model of white women that's the exact opposite. Historically, they've been portrayed as models of self-respect, self-control, modesty, even sexual purity, whereas black women were often portrayed as innately promiscuous or even predatory. It was said that these black women, who we say were raped, weren't actually raped. They actually threw themselves on these white men and boys. And they just couldn't help themselves. The women just chased them until they had to give up. It was nothing they could do. These women just had this magic spell over them. And so we still see that image of black women being portrayed in the music business by people like Nicki Minaj to this day. The Mammy caricature, we've all seen Aunt Jemima pancake boxes. We probably ate Aunt Jemima pancakes when we were children. I know I did. And this caricature of black women, this contented, even happy slave, wide grin, hearty laughter, very loyal servant, never complained. She was oftentimes obese and very coarse, and she treated her own family with disdain. Her family wasn't important. Her children were not important because she had to take care of masters' children. And so she was completely desexualized in this caricature. She wasn't interested in being sexual in any way because she wanted to be a part of the white family. She wanted to belong and be this faithful worker. And she had no black friends. Her entire world revolved around the white family that she worked for. The Coon caricature, Martin Lawrence. A lot of people I know love this Martin Lawrence show back in the day. I hated it. I could not stand him acting like a coon on a regular basis. It used to really drive me crazy that people thought it was funny. But this is an image that goes back to the days of slavery where the coon was portrayed as lazy, easily frightened, chronically idle, inarticulate, a buffoon. He acted childishly, he was very lazy, and too cynical to try to change his station in life. And so that is oftentimes portrayed even to this day in movies and television. So I guess you guys know that I'm kind of very much attached to lynching because the founder of the museum, Dr. James Cameron, was lynched. This is a lynching that took place in Duluth, Minnesota. These 3 young black men were murdered as a result of a young white girl and her boyfriend coming to the circus and deciding to play a joke and pretending that she was attacked and raped by some black men. So they rounded up these black men who worked for the circus, and they ended up murdering these 3 young men. So lynching of blacks was the ultimate manifestation of white power in America. It was the ultimate way to really tell black people that your life had no value other than the value that we give to it. And so in many cases when lynchings occurred, especially of black men, they would take souvenirs, they would take clothing, they would cut off body parts as souvenirs, and so this is part of the ritual of mass lynchings. And one of the interesting things also is how people pose for these pictures. You have so many pictures of people posing, and these weren't just some random person who came up with a camera and snapped a picture. You can see that they have the lights and stuff in the background set up so that they can get the perfect picture. The same thing happened with the lynching of Dr. Cameron. And so this is part of the ritual of devaluing black lives in the most ultimate way you could do so. So let's look at America. There are currently a little more than 79 million whites living in America who were born before Jim Crow laws became unconstitutional. Almost 80 million people. There are more than 23 million whites living in America who are over the age of 70. These are people that were born in or before 1945 and socialized in a nation where discrimination against blacks was both legal and widely accepted. It was a norm. Nobody said, you know, that's just the way we do things. It was perfectly legal, and if you didn't fall into this and accept it and have it part of your life, then you were going to be called out by other whites. And so we still have those people around. The young man, 21-year-old Dylan Roof, who murdered 9 people in a Charleston, South Carolina church, wrote a manifesto, and this is one of the things he said. I was not raised in a racist home or environment. I was not raised in a racist home or environment. So we asked ourselves, where did this hatred that he had, where did it come from? Well, there are many sources throughout America where you can find people talking in this particular way, giving you expressions of these racist ideas that become embedded in who you are as a person, and it happened to him. He took upon himself to begin to study these things about the Confederacy and whatnot, became entrenched with it. It kind of took over his mindset. He says the trigger for him was the Trayvon Martin case. He said, I don't know why they're making such a big deal out of it. He should have been killed. So that led him eventually to massacre these 9 innocent people at a church just a few weeks ago. So what allows this devaluation of black lives to occur so easily throughout American history? There's some mechanism that's in place that allows people to devalue black lives, to kill them, to beat them, to maim them, to do all of these things, and do it very easily. So one of the things that I found was this concepts that 2 professors, I believe they work at Texas A&M University, came up with. One of the theories that they came up with is this idea of what they call Alexithymia, when people are unable to understand the emotions of and empathize with others. So you don't have the ability to empathize with people that you're doing these things to. And so since you don't have the ability to empathize with them, it doesn't bother you to do these things to them. This is one of the things that the military actually trains people to do. It trains you to not have any empathy for the enemy, and it makes it easy for you to kill them if you don't have empathy. If you have empathy for somebody, you're going to have a very difficult time pulling the trigger and killing somebody. So you have to lose that empathy, and what this process is, they call it alexithymia. There's also another version of it, which they call social alexithymia. And this is a reduced ability to understand or relate to the emotions, such as recurring pain of those targeted by oppression. And so this is why for century after century, decade after decade, year after year, month after month, week after week, day after day, in America, people could do these horrible things to black people and not think twice about it. To actually pose in front of dead bodies and be proud of it. These are the mechanisms that are in place. And these theories were developed by Joe Fegan and Hernan Vera, 2 professors who've studied race issues for a number of years. For, I believe Dr. Fegan has been studying these issues for about 30 years.
I just finished a project on what I call the white racial frame, which is the worldview that we white Americans have developed over 4 centuries now to explain and interpret and rationalize the system of racial oppression that we put into place now over 4 centuries. The frame explains and interprets things like slavery and legal segregation and now contemporary discrimination in the society.
So that's Dr. Fegan. He's written a series of books, excellent books that he's written. I highly recommend that you guys look him up and find some of his books. He does an excellent job of explaining this white racial frame, explaining the role that race has played in American history. He's absolutely outstanding at that. So let's move on. Jim Crow was a tool used to devalue and marginalize black lives for a very long period of time. So by limiting not only the physical but also the emotional space that black people were able to occupy, America said loudly and clearly to them that you are not valuable enough to be in the presence of white people. You are not valuable enough to have advantages afforded white people in America. And so throughout America you saw these signs that said, we watch for white people only, no colored allowed, different drinking fountains for blacks and whites, public swimming pool, white only. There was a public swimming pool in my hometown in Mississippi that was a white only swimming pool, and there was another swimming pool that was a black only swimming pool. That's the one that I swam in as a kid. So we saw these signs, and one of the things I think that's important to understand about Jim Crow is it wasn't just this separation of people. That's what we typically think of, this separation. You can't eat in the same restaurants and all these other things. There are other things that were related to it that are extremely important. So I want you guys to listen to this very carefully.
This is a special report from American Radio Works, Remembering Jim Crow. I'm Deborah Amos. It lasted about 80 years. It seized every state in the American South. People died because of it, went hungry because of it, lived in fear and misery because of it. They called it Jim Crow. White authorities in the South imposed a system of laws and social customs designed to deny African Americans their dignity and their rights as citizens.
Alabama. All passenger stations in this state operated by any motor transportation company shall have separate waiting rooms or space and separate ticket windows for the white and colored races.
North Carolina. School textbooks shall not be interchangeable between the white and colored schools, but shall continue to be used by the race first using them.
Mississippi. The marriage of a white person with a Negro or mulatto or person who shall have 1/8 or more of Negro blood shall be unlawful and void.
My mother would have the occasion to send me to this grocery store I told you about that was approximately a mile away. She would give me instruction before I leave home and tell me, say, son, now you pass any white people on your way, say, you get off the sidewalk, give them the sidewalk, you know. You move over, don't challenge white people.
If you went to town during the week, Monday through Friday, the sheriff, well, what are you doing up here? Well, you better get out of town. But on Saturday, you could stay all day. That was the day they said for the blacks.
Why?
I don't know. You could just stay up there all day long, but through the week, you weren't allowed up there.
Because if they got paid on Friday, they'll come to town on Saturday and spend the money. That was their attitude.
That's right.
So black people would see, this was like a picnic to them. They would see their friends, their relatives, and make acquaintances and whatnot. And that's the reason Saturday was the day that they called Black People's Day.
You couldn't go to eat in a restaurant, or if they served you at all, you went around to a window in the back of the place, right at the kitchen, you see.
My grandfather was just as free of a white man he was a rattlesnake, because he'd been beaten and knocked about, so much. He just, no matter what you say or do, let them have their way. Don't you say nothing back to them, no matter what they did.
Well, my grandmother always told us this: you have a certain place and stay in it. That was automatic. You didn't have to think about it. You knew it and you were taught it.
Jim Crow emerges in the 1890s in response to perceptions, not
not altogether incorrect. Perceptions of a new generation of black Southerners born in freedom, undisciplined by slavery, unschooled in the old racial etiquette, and in response to fears that this generation could not be expected to stay in its place without some kind of legal coercion.
It meant the ugly signs that you saw them at the railroad stations, saw them at the bus stations, you saw them when you were traveling. It said Negroes to the rear, and it meant that room that was white was always bigger, always had more seats, and was always better kept. So that was the crust of Jim Crowism, to prevent a group of citizens from being a part of what they rightfully should have been a part of.
My name is Glenda Elizabeth Gilmore. I'm a professor of history at Yale University. Jim Crow was a word that white and black Southerners used for an elaborate system of white supremacy, a system that was established both through legislation in the courts and through custom. It could mean anything from being unable to vote, to being segregated, to being lynched. It was part and parcel of a system of white supremacy, sort of like we use the word apartheid today as a code word to symbolize a certain kind of white supremacy.
White men and women are dressed as Mr. and Mrs. You didn't address blacks that way. And don't make a mistake talking to a white person about a black person and call him Mr. I was talking about some black woman who was supervising schools of black folks, and I kept saying Miss So-and-so. So finally the white woman stopped and said, yeah, that woman you talking about, she black or white? Oh, she black, but don't miss her to me then. Let's call her by first name. Don't ever miss a black person to me. I said, no ma'am.
So Jim Crow was more than just this laws that segregated, bathrooms and movie theaters and laundries and whatnot. It was this all-encompassing system that permeated everything within the lives of blacks and whites, particularly in the South, but also in the North. We didn't see the signs in the North, but the customs were there. In Milwaukee, Woolworth stores wouldn't serve black customers for a long period of time. And so this issue of Jim Crow was not just something that was a Southern institution, as many people believe. So let's move on. I'm sure a lot of you remember the introduction of blacks into the Little Rock Central High School. This picture was taken September 4th, 1957. The group of students was supposed to meet at the school today. They got their times mixed up, and this young woman ended up going by herself. And she was accosted by a crowd of hundreds of whites who were yelling at her and eventually tried to attack her. Someone saved her though. Standing behind her is this woman here who's been identified as Hazel Bryan, and she's shouting at this young woman, "Go home, nigger. Go back to Africa." And so these were some of the indignities that were suffered simply by attempting to integrate a school. So let's look at how America has taught the world to see black people. They say that a picture is worth 1,000 words. So there have been native images of blacks throughout American history. These are some that were very common in sheet music. These were some coon songs that were written. And so these images of these black coons who were eating watermelon, you see the very dark skin, the big thick red lips. This is a part of how white people portrayed blacks. And so this is very common. So I want to tell you guys, share this story with you. I was talking to a guy a couple weeks ago, and he shared this story with me. So this black guy had gone to a conference, and they were having lunch after the conference, shifted to lunch, and they were going to do some more things in the afternoon. So they had a really nice spread of food, a bunch of, different types of food. They had fruits and they had vegetables and a whole bunch of stuff that was very good. He said the food was excellent. So he's standing there and he sees, they have some watermelon there. And so there's one other black person at the conference. And so they're standing there together getting ready to get their food. And the guy's like, I'm going to grab some watermelon. And this other black guy says, man, you're not going to get any watermelon now. No. And he said, what do you mean? I'm not going to get any watermelon. He said, that's a stereotype. He says, no, that's a delicious fruit. And I want to eat some of it. And he ate the watermelon and nobody bothered him about it. But just the paranoia about eating some watermelon. I know black people that will not eat watermelon in front of white people. They will not eat fried chicken in front of white people. You have to be crazy, but that's what's been embedded into the minds of black people, that it's a stereotype that we like watermelon, as if nobody else eats watermelon. So that's in the minds of Americans. So how many of you have said or heard this? Things aren't as bad as they used to be. Young people don't have the mindset of their parents and grandparents. Raise your hand if you heard somebody say it or you said it yourself, right? I hear this all the time. We've come a long way. Look at this. And remember, these are college students. These are the young people who are going to get in their education to become the leaders of American businesses and governments and things of this nature, institutions within American society. And this is the way they celebrate Martin Luther King Day at the University of Connecticut in 2007. Some additional pictures from that same so-called party. You see, this is how they view black people. 40-ounce drinks, padded behind here. These are the ways that they celebrated Martin Luther King Day, to mock that day. These are some additional students at the same university. These are other additional images of parties from other universities around the country where white students were mocking black people. And these in particular happened, I don't know if you guys remember the case of the Gen 6, these young black men in Jena, Louisiana, who were accused of some terrible crimes for getting into a fight at school. Those images came up right maybe within a month or 2 months after that case. Let's continue. More recent, January 2014, Arizona State University fraternity holds a racist Martin Luther King Day party. And so you see some of the images here, and eventually they suspended the charter for them, but these are some images that they took pictures of. And it says here, balling with the Wildermuth, Wild Boys and Girl. Hashtag Black Out for MLK, hashtag I Have a Dream. 2014, January. September 2013, a University of Alabama sorority kicks out a member for sending a racist Snapchat picture. And so they had some new members joining, and she was very happy to say that they had not accepted any blacks. So Chi got no niggas. And so one of the things that was attached to this article that I found is the recent reports in Alabama student newspaper highlighted segregated sororities, prompting administrators to order changes in recruitment. University President Judy Bonner referred to the system as being racially segregated and said at least some membership decisions were based on race. This is in 2014. December 2014. University of Maryland sorority member posts racist Instagram photo, and she not only posted this photo, but you can't really see what this says here, so I wrote it for you. The blurred out portion, which they blurred out of the picture, it said, blurred portion said, hashtag sucker niggas, you know what. And she sent this out on Instagram, in addition to having the N-word on the cake as well. So this is in December 2014. I'm sure most of you have either heard about or seen this racist chant by these students at the University of Oklahoma, Sigma Alpha Epsilon chapter. It shows you how they feel about black people, because they said there will never be a nigger in SAE. There will never be a nigger in SAE. You can hang him from a tree, but he'll never sign with me. There will never be a nigger in SAE. And there was a chant that everybody on the bus kind of, they knew it. They were familiar with. It wasn't something somebody just came up with. It's something that they were all familiar with. So it wasn't like this was the first time they had done it or said it. It was probably passed down from generation to generation within the Sigmas. And so if you go to their website, they have in big bold words, their creed is the true gentleman. The true gentleman. This was a young man who replied to the response, because people said, oh, it was just a joke. They were just having fun. And so this young man apparently didn't agree with that assessment. He said they didn't mean it. It was just a joke. You expect me to believe that a rehearsed and synchronized racist chant was a joke? Because that's what people were saying to excuse these young men. Obviously it wasn't something that was unfamiliar to them. So it goes further than just these images in America. When I was in the Navy, we went to Sydney, Australia. This was in maybe 1986, I believe. And a group of my friends and I, we went to this little bar, and they were drinking. I didn't drink. I still don't drink. But they were having drinks, and it was a group of Australian guys that were there. And, very friendly, extremely friendly people. They came over and talked to us and stuff. And one of the guys in the group, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the character on Fat Albert's show, the cartoon that Bill Cosby had years ago. And he says, ah, badoo, badoo, talks like that. This guy came over to us, and after he had too many drinks, he actually came over and told us to talk like that. And we were like, dude, that's a cartoon character. Nobody really talks like that in real life. He says, yes, they do. I know you guys can do it. Just come on, when are you guys doing it for me, please? And he just went on and on badgering us about this, to the point that some of my friends were ready to beat the living daylights out of him. But his friends were like, they just kind of took him away and said, we apologize. He's had too much to drink. So these images of blacks have been, exported overseas. And so you'll see a clear example of that here. Japanese students in blackface, 2009. They've exported this mindset about black people around the entire globe. Very common images that you find all over the internet. You type in blackface in Google and you will find thousands of these types of images. They are everywhere. Very, very common. How many of you guys remember when Ted Danson wore the blackface? He was going to some party with Whoopi Goldberg, and people were like all over Whoopi Goldberg for attending the party with him, because she said she didn't see anything wrong with it. And they were like, well, it must be something wrong with you. And so all the flack went to her instead of him. This is amazing to me. This movie, Tropic Thunder, came out in 2008. Robert Downey Jr., the guy that's famous for the Iron Man movies, the character he played, he wore blackface. I only saw bits and pieces of the movie because I thought the movie was going to be garbage anyway. But they should be embarrassed to make a movie in this day and time with somebody in blackface and think there's nothing wrong with it. But obviously the studio spent millions of dollars making this film, and they had no issue with it. You see some more young white people in blackface. They think it's hilarious. They think it's absolutely hilarious to do this. They have no issue having their picture taken and posting it to their Facebook or their Instagram or wherever, so people around the world can see it. You'll find so many negative images of President and Mrs. Obama all over the internet. I'm telling you, there are thousands of these. Thousands of these. The indignity suffered by this president, tops anything that's ever been done in any other president. Obviously, presidents have been ridiculed. People ridiculed, Nixon for the way he talked, and they ridiculed Gerald Ford for being clumsy and falling all the time, and they ridiculed, Bill Clinton for playing the saxophone. Nobody has ever been ridiculed in such a way as President Obama. This man is the leader of our country, and people sit down and spend time creating these racist images of him or creating these bumper stickers and selling them. That's the mindset of America.
No. It's not the mindset of America. Look what happened to the Indians when they made a movie over there, and the director or the actor wanted to criticize the Indians, make fun of the Indians, and the Indians protested and walked away from film. What is happening is that there's so much discrimination going on for the minorities, not only the blacks, the minorities, because they're climbing. There is a majority of minority, so there is going to be discrimination because the white has controlled the country for so many years. But it's not America, sir. I come from very good family, first governor of New Mexico, last name was Vigil, and we always help the poor, and it's going to continue.
I have to disagree with you, ma'am. There are always exceptions to the rule, and I'm showing you the rule. This is not, I'm not just randomly finding stuff that's hard to find. These things are everywhere. There are thousands of people sitting right now, I would guess, making more images just like these. This is not the exception. This is the America that we live in.
Your America. If you set negativism on your people, you find it. You find it. And that's what you're doing. You're seeking the negativism instead of throwing it in the trash.
I grew up in the South, and everything he says is true. It is endemic in this country and has been
I
for
really
400
believe
years.
that there is a good God, and I believe that if you continue pushing the negative, you belong
Well, we
with the
came
negative.
here to listen to Reggie. Would you let him finish, please?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Ma'am, I think you misunderstand what I'm here for.
You're crazy to criticize America.
I don't
America's
think that you're
good.
listening very carefully, ma'am.
You're
Thank you for
listening.
coming. I appreciate you coming. Please come back again. Appreciate you. I'm not condescending. I said I hope she comes back.
You're pushing negativism. You're crazy.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Appreciate you.
Thank you.
Anyway,
Thank you.
so these images are everywhere. They are everywhere. This is the mindset of America. I'm not saying it's everybody. Obviously, we know it's not everybody. But it's so pernicious. It's so deeply ingrained in the minds of people that these images are the same types of images we saw in the 1870s of blacks. This is 2015. What's changed since 1870 in terms of how blacks are portrayed? The same exact types of images. It hasn't changed that much. This is one that I found to be absolutely hilarious when it happened. So this is an undergraduate application book at UW-Madison. Somebody looked at the cover, which was this cover they were going to put on it, and they said, we don't have any black people.
Oh my.
They took this picture at a football game, Badger football game. And so they decided, instead of going back to a different game and taking a picture and finding a black person in the crowd, that they would just Photoshop a black person into the picture. And thought nobody would notice. That is amazing to me. Absolutely amazing.
Where is the black person?
Oh, on the left is one.
Right here. This person that they Photoshopped into the picture. Didn't exist. They just found a picture of a black person and said, whoop, now we have a black person at the game that wasn't there. And they thought nobody would notice. All right, so let's look at the psychological damage. How this devaluing of black lives impacts black people. Because it's had a huge impact on the minds and the bodies of black people for a number of years. It leads to self-devaluation, self-hatred, this inferiority complex. You guys recognize Sammy Sosa? This was when he was a young player playing with the Texas Rangers before he was traded to the Chicago Cubs, and slamming Sammy there in the heyday when he was hitting, 60 and 70 odd home runs. Very popular, one of the most popular players in baseball. And this is a recent picture of him about, I believe, 4 to 5 years ago. So you see the difference in terms of how he looks. So within an oppressive society, what happens to the people that are oppressed, you begin to have this inferiority complex, which embeds the minds of some people. Not everybody, but it really impacts a lot of people, and it's this unrealistic feeling of inadequacy caused by actual or supposed inferiority in one sphere of life. It manifests itself as a lack of self-worth, a doubt and uncertainty, feelings of not measuring up to standards. And it's often subconscious, and it drives individuals to overcompensate. And so this happens subtly in some people, but more openly and outwardly in other people. So these are some words that Gandhi said about destiny. He said, your beliefs become your thoughts become your words become your actions become your habits become your values become your destiny. So if you live in a world that has devalued you and people that are like you for decades, for centuries, think about how it makes you feel about yourself and what destiny is it going to lead you to later. So how has devaluing Black lives impacted the psyche of blacks? There have been a number of ways that it has. The standards of virtue and beauty have always in America been defined as those of whites. Always have been defined as those of whites. The image of beauty in terms of women has always been a white woman. The image of virtue, a white woman in most cases. So these societal norms are assumed to be the norms of white society. And these most often, nowadays in particular, the value system that we associate with white middle class values. And so as a black person, you can't realistically live up to these norms. It doesn't fit with the environment that you live in. And so what you try to do, though, is you try to fit in anyway. You try to fit in because you don't want to be seen as an outcast. You don't want to not be a part of this America that's supposed to be so wonderful. So you try to compensate and you try to fit in. Malcolm X said these words in a speech in Los Angeles where some young black men had been killed by the Los Angeles Police Department. And as he was talking to the crowd that was gathered there, he said, "Who taught you to hate the texture of your hair? Who taught you to hate the color of your skin? To such extent you bleach. Who taught you to hate the shape of your nose and the shape of your lips? Who taught you to hate yourself from the top of your head to the soles of your feet?" Everybody there knew the answer. He didn't have to tell them the answer. They knew the answer. But he was just letting them know that you didn't feel this way when you got off those boats coming from Africa. Your ancestors didn't feel this way about themselves. They were taught to see themselves and feel this way about themselves.
Do you like that word?
No.
Good. Why?
Because I don't like to be called black.
Okay. Why? Tell me why.
Because I'm not black.
There were others who had been either from birth, from rape, from slave owners who had produced children who were somehow different in complexion than others. These children, they were stratified within that society, dependent upon their complexion. There were sometimes more than 64 distinctions in terms of color shade, hair gradation, and those kinds of stuff by name. And the culture, the society would actually learn these subtle distinctions and apply them such that people then were allocated status based on that.
The racism that we have as a people amongst ourselves is a direct backlash of slavery. The House niggas versus the field niggas, the paper bag rule, if you're darker than a paper bag.
Well, I know growing up in Harlem, I've heard others mention things regarding the paper bag test or being a member of Snow and Blow. If your skin was white as snow and it blew in the wind, that gave you some level of credibility or desirability.
The paper bag test, when I first heard about it, my mother told me about it. If you were lighter than the brown paper bag, then you was considered beautiful, smart. You passed that test. If you were darker than that, then you were considered dark and unattractive.
What we've been talking about and what we spend time with is to attempt to shift that internalized colorism, if you will, the sense that being dark-skinned is good. And we've had moments, and the black and the berry, the sweet and juice, say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud. But they've been short-term moments because we consistently exist in a broader, worldwide, white supremacist framework where color and one's approximation of whiteness is valued around the world.
These, conceptions about, color come from within our race. I feel like certain people who may have lighter skin try to boost their self-esteem and to boost their, their self-worth up by putting others down because they know that darker skin, I guess, isn't considered beautiful, and so that kind of puts them up on that pedestal, like saying, hey, I'm more beautiful than you because my skin is fair.
You know what's weird? I get a lot of compliments about my complexion from white people. They love my skin. And it's sad to say, but as a younger person coming up, white people really made me appreciate my skin color. Black people made me question it.
A friend of mine had recently had a baby, and I was very happy for her. And so, it was my first time seeing a baby, and the baby was beautiful. And she said, girl, I'm so glad she didn't come out dark. And when she said it, it felt like a dagger, like someone took a dagger and stuck it in my heart, because I was used to hearing things like that from other races. But this was someone that I considered to be my sister.
So many of us are trained, even as children, we come up and shown so many images to try to make it a truth. So when you get married, everybody's wearing white. When you go to the funeral, everybody's wearing black. And day is perfect and fabulous and wonderful, and night is sinister and negative. So we can address it to ourselves, so we can connect it to ourselves, so we can justify hating this beautiful, wonderful color that we...
I think skin color amongst the black community is a huge issue in our time, and you still hear a lot of commentary, you still hear preferences, and now with the age of the internet and blogs, now you really get to see what people are really thinking, because they can hide behind computers and people can make their comments, and it's really shocking and disgusting at the same time to see a lot of the comments that are made by black people about other black people.
Just recently, one of my younger cousins, he's a senior in high school, posted on Facebook on his status, I love white girls, just period, and nobody can do anything about it. And I commented on his status and said, that's fine, just make sure you don't discriminate. And then one of his friends posted, it's not, their fault that white skin just looks better on females. It wasn't so much I felt like it was an insult to me exactly. I just felt like it was sad that someone who I knew, a young guy who was part of my family and his friends, and then other people in my family as well, feel that way, really feel that way. And it was just really upset me.
She's the smart child. And why is she the smart child?
Because she is white.
Show me the dumb child. And why is she the dumb child?
Because she fake.
Well, show me the ugly child. And why is she the ugly child?
Because she black.
Show me the good-looking child. And why is she the good-looking child?
Because she light-skinned.
It's really, I think, important that we begin to understand how early in our life that begins to affect how we see our identity. I have a 4-year-old who, at 2 years of age, was really beginning to demonstrate to me how the images that she saw, whether it's on the Disney Channel or whether it's in a animation, how different she is from the images that are portrayed.
Raising my daughter, it is very different from raising my sons, especially since I'm not going to know, or I don't really know her battle. And the reason that I know that she has a battle now is because it has become evident. She does not like to be called black. She doesn't even correlate like that. We're just lighter brown than she is, to be honest with you. I just never thought about it until I had her, because I can see it. I can see the difference. I can see when she is at a party, or we're at a center, or or she's exposed to the playground, or she takes dance class. I can see the difference. I can see how they treat her differently. She may not feel it. She may not understand it, but I know it's there.
The impact that it has on those very, very young children spiritually is that they actually start to devalue themselves in such a way where the spirit begins to shrink.
The things I used to do because I hated my color was I used to wish that I can wake up one day lighter, or wash my face and think that it will change or get lighter. I thought it was dirt and I tried to clean it off, but it wouldn't come off. I took my color after my father and I used to hate him because of it.
I think I remember most saying that, if I had a little girl, I didn't want her to be dark. I didn't want her to be dark like me.
So you guys can see very clearly how damaging this is to so many different people. And it's something that I don't think that we talk enough about. We don't talk about, there's this idea of post-traumatic stress disorder. Imagine if we could go back in time and treat all of these black people that have suffered post-traumatic stress disorder. Imagine that. If they could go and get that treatment that people now routinely get. People in the military routinely get this. Let's continue. So people who feel that they don't fit in, that they don't fit this model of beauty, they try to assimilate, they try to fit in. Whether they be poor people, wealthy people, well-known people, whatever, they try to fit in. You can notice the changes in Janet Jackson here, in particular her nose. Look at that nose. This is not the nose she was born with. Lil' Kim, she's transformed herself into something nobody knows what she is nowadays. Nobody. My wife was like, who is that? I was like, that's Lil' Kim. She's like, what? I said, it's Lil' Kim. Another member of the Jackson family, LaToya, the older sister. Look at her. She was, I believe, the first person in the family to have this type of plastic surgery done. There are people that are selling skin bleaching cream as we speak. This is one of the companies. Better Complexions. Our exclusive better complexion skin bleaching creams and skin lightening products contain the most effective ingredients available for whitening your skin. Best suited for those with dark skin tones, allows you to lighten your dark skin to a lighter tone to achieve that golden glow. Imagine that. Think about that for a few seconds. Michael Jackson, a progressive rejection of who he was, never comfortable in his skin, never comfortable with his face. You can see the changes from album to album. And what makes it even worse, that it got much, much worse for Michael. And I can remember people used to joke, only in America can a poor black boy grow up to become a rich white woman. Because that seems like that's what he wanted to be. And that is the ultimate in rejection of oneself. Self-hatred embedded in the membrane. So let's look at the impact of this devaluation on black lives, how people deal with it. So you become alienated from your culture and history, from your language. One of the first things they did when they transported Africans here was they made sure that in Africa they got people from different regions that spoke different languages so they couldn't communicate on the ships. They didn't want them to be able to communicate. When they came here, they couldn't speak their native language without risk of being beaten or killed. So you discharge from your language, your history, who you are as a people. And Frantz Fanon wrote these words: to speak a language is to take on a world, a culture. The Negro who wants to be white will be whiter as he gains greater mastery of the cultural tool that language is. Speaking of Martinique, that's the island that he was born on, the language imposed was French. One took pains to speak the French of France, the Frenchman's French, French. He also said that being forced to speak the language of the oppressor was an affirmation of him, his worldview, and his value system, an acceptance of your oppressor. There's this idea called auto-oppression, and this is the way it works. Once a group of people have been so completely devalued for generations, they begin to believe these things about themselves. It becomes so embedded that they believe it's the truth. And as a result of them believing it's the truth, they begin to change how they interact with each other. They begin to do to themselves what those who have traditionally devalued them have done, and believe subconsciously that they deserve it. They become auto-oppressors. So the oppressors don't have to do that much work anymore, because now you're doing it yourself. There's another concept called displaced aggression. This devalued person manifested this energy, this negative energy in their bones. It becomes a part of their psyche, and they will beat each other up. And the police do not know which way to turn when faced with astonishing waves of crime. The victim of prolonged oppression learns to take the violent assaults very patiently, yet they are too much to bear. He turns his anger as well as frustration against himself and his own people. The result is a higher incidence of alcoholism, psychiatric disorder, hypertension, and homicide. The person who wrote this book that these quotes come from, about Frantz Fanon, he compared the lives of blacks in America with the lives of blacks in apartheid-era South Africa. And he found that the rates of hypertension were almost the same. The homicide rates were almost the same. The suicide rates were almost the same. The rates of every negative thing that you can imagine were very, very similar between those two groups of people. Homicidal mindset as a result of the devaluation of black lives. If he cannot defend his personality in the larger social arena, he must by all means defend what is left of it in his last refuge, namely in the circle of his family and friends. The slightest challenge, rejection, or offense by those worthy of his love or respect pushes him to a volcanic eruption of a repressed aggression. Most people are killed by somebody they know. 70% of Americans that are murdered by somebody they know. We oftentimes hear on the news about random people killing strangers and whatnot, but most people are killed by somebody they know. In fact, in Milwaukee, over the 4th of July weekend, I was listening to this on my way down, there were 4 people who were murdered in Milwaukee, shot to death. In addition to that, there were 6 other people who were shot that actually survived their shootings over the weekend in Milwaukee. So if we look back, the Milwaukee Police Department used to do these reports about homicide and looked at it, and you see that the victims of homicide in Milwaukee, almost 90% are male, and exactly 90% of the suspects are male blacks. 86% of the victims are male, black males, 90% of the suspects are black males. So black males are taking out this frustration, this displaced aggression against each other. The way displaced aggression works is if we get mad at somebody at work, we know we can't really say anything to our boss, so we come home and we take it out on our family. We kick the dog, we slap the kids, we slam our wife against the dresser, and we get all of that aggression, all of that anger out of our system on a safe, convenient target. And this is what these young black men are doing. They're angry at their situation that they're living in. And they're taking out on somebody that's a safe and convenient target, someone who looks just like them. Premature death as a result of devaluation of black lives. Those who fear physical death and submit to oppression invariably condemn themselves to psychological, social, and historical death. The oppressed submit for fear of physical death, but because they submit, they become ill more frequently and die at an earlier age. So this devaluation leads to your life being shorter. You die at a younger age as a result of being a victim of oppression and being devalued for decade after decade. I say this, the more things change, remember we talked earlier about the 1669 Act in Virginia that said the casual killing of slaves is perfectly okay if they resist their master, and it will not be presumed to have occurred with prepense malice. And I said that they were basically giving white people permission to murder black men, women, and children. They made it legal to kill black people with no worry about being punished for it. That was in 1669. If we look, 2012 to 2015, numerous cases of unarmed blacks being killed while resisting police and vigilantes will not be presumed to have occurred with malice by the judicial system in most cases. Eric Garner is choked to death with 3 people videotaping on his cell phones. No charges against the officers. Michael Brown is killed by a police officer because he's jaywalking. No charges against the police officer. Trayvon Martin just so happens to be walking in the so-called wrong area after coming from a store, and he's killed by a vigilante. No charges. So people are seeing this, and they recognize that people still have permission to kill black people the same as they did in 1669. Yet we want to believe that things have changed so much. The reality teaches us that things have changed, but they haven't changed all that much. People killed blacks in 1669, didn't receive any punishment. We're still seeing it today. Our next session, Wednesday, we're going to look at legal and political devaluation of black lives in America and look at the legal status of blacks in American history. We're going to trace the debates about slavery and citizenship rights for blacks. We'll answer this question that I always ask. Why do we need a civil rights movement in light of all of the laws that were already in place to protect the rights that blacks had? The role played by political parties in the devaluation of blacks will be addressed. We will also examine important Supreme Court decisions related to the value of black lives. Now remember I said earlier, if you have questions, if you've written any questions down, just feel free to pass those up. Anybody else who wants to write some questions, I have cards here if anybody wants cards. I have pens. Oh, sorry. Here you go. We need a pen? There you go. Okay, thank you. All right. Okay. All right. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go through the questions. Thank you. Thank you. And I'll do my best. So this question says, since an enslaved African was property, wouldn't killing one amount to destruction of property and be avoided? A slave might cost $2,500 or $25,000 in today's dollars. Absolutely. One of the things that people went out of their way to do was to protect the property that they had. Now, in most cases, if a black person who was enslaved was actually killed by their master, it was because they were resisting their master in some way. Frederick Douglass, in his autobiography, he talks about this one very, very physically abusive man that he had been sold to. And he talks about, and he was a kid, I believe, 14 or 15 at the time, and he talked about how this man would just beat the crap out of him regularly, and he made his mind up that it wasn't going to happen anymore. And he had a fight with this man. He said they fought for like 2 hours. But he said that man never put hands on him again after that. So people would go out of their way to protect their property because this is a valuable piece of property they have, and they typically didn't want to kill them. But if they did, it was okay. They simply bought someone else. But typically, though, they didn't want to. So that's a very good question. Let's see. Why was the statutory recognition of slavery occur in Georgia in 1750, more than 100 years after Massachusetts? Georgia became a part of the United States in 1750. It started off as a colony, and it was a penal colony. Much like Australia was a penal colony when it started, Georgia was a penal colony. And so they very quickly began to move Africans there as a workforce. But they didn't become a part of the United States until 1750. Don't the Mike Tysons, Tyler Perry's, Nicki Minaj's reinforce the brute, Sapphire, and Jezebel characters or stereotypes? How can they be countered? Well, absolutely they do. Not necessarily on purpose, but you have to look at what all of these people have in common. Mike Tyson, Tyler Perry, Nicki Minaj. What do they all have in common?
Famous and they're wealthy.
They're all entertainers.
Yeah.
They're all entertainers. Boxers are entertainers. Tyler Perry's an actor. He's an entertainer. Nicki Minaj is a singer and a rapper. She's an entertainer. If you look, and I do this quite often. I think about, and I had a conversation with a young man that lives across the street from me about this just a couple of days ago, about rap music and how it's perpetuating this negativity and whatnot. And I told him, I said, there's a certain part of me that wants to blame them for it, but then there's another part of me that says they're just trying to feed their families. They're doing what they're being paid to do. The record companies are promoting all of this negativity in music because they're making millions of dollars doing it. If you don't do it, they'll find somebody else that will. But I don't believe that, and I heard Tyler Perry talk about this, and people say that his characters in his movies and his plays and his television shows are buffoons and coons and things of this nature. He says it's just humor. He says all the things we've suffered, we need to be able to laugh at ourselves. That's what he says. So, you know, we can talk to them and say that they're doing something that's negative, but I don't think that it's going to change their perception. I don't think Nicki Minaj is going to stop being this Jezebel character because she's making money doing it. She's, like they used to say, she's using what her mama gave her. And she's making money. So it's very hard to convince somebody, especially somebody in the music industry that's making that type of money. Now, Mike Tyson's a little bit different. Mike Tyson was a prize fighter. But Mike Tyson was bigger than life outside the ring. Most boxers, you just know them from inside the ring. Mike Tyson was his character outside of the ring. And now he's kind of taken that and kind of developed this new Mike Tyson that's this funny guy, and he has this show in Vegas and whatnot. So he's kind of transformed himself from that brute figure. But that was a part of who he was. What kind of reparations would really help? Now that's interesting that someone asked that. I just was part of a conference 2 weeks ago. There's a group called In Cobra, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, and they had their national conference in Milwaukee 2 weeks ago. And I was actually a participant in that conference. I did a presentation on lynching and the founder of the museum, Dr. James Cameron. And so there's been, when people think of the term reparations, I think most people automatically assume that, people are looking for some monetary handout, as people like to call it. Black people should be given a check for such as. But when you look at reparations, and most people aren't aware that the first time a black person said that we deserve reparations was actually in the early 1800s. There's a woman who had been enslaved, and she gained her freedom, and one of the first things she did was she said, I deserve to be paid for all of that work that I did. And she actually she actually filed a lawsuit to try to be paid all of these wages for all of this free work she had been given. And so that was the first attempt by blacks to even have a discussion about reparations. John Conyers from Michigan has consistently, year after year after year, made this proposal called House Resolution 40 to push, not for reparations, but for the federal government to study whether or not reparations are even something to be considered. And it can't get out of committee. Time and time again. So the people at the conference talked about reparations in this way. Reparations are tools designed to repair someone who has been damaged. Money cannot repair psychological damage. I don't care how much money somebody gives you, it can't repair what's inside of your head. So the people that are fighting for reparations in the country are looking at it in a holistic manner. They're talking about things such as providing free college for every black person in America. Free college. Having black people be basically free of paying taxes to the federal government for the rest of their lives. And there's studies that have been done trying to quantify the amount of free labor that was done, what that labor would have actually cost just during the days of slavery. That's not counting the de facto slavery that occurred after official slavery ended. And I've seen two different estimates. One estimate, the guy said that it's like $3 trillion worth of free labor. And that times money, which would be just a ridiculous amount of money today. Another estimate said that the figure is higher because he included slavery and all of this labor that was done by blacks for free, basically during Jim Crow as well. He estimates that it's something like $25 trillion. So when you look at reparations, what would help? I think the things that would provide opportunities socially, free education, free of taxes, providing scholarships and schooling and things. Those are the things that they were really pushing more so than anything else at the reparations conference. So changing the society, changing some of the patterns of how our society has interacted with blacks over the years is usually what the people that are talking about reparations are talking about. And this is an international movement for reparations, because people forget that Africans were transported to many other places in the United States. There are people in Dominican Republic, in Haiti, in Jamaica, Trinidad, Tobago, Bermuda, the Bahamas, all of these different places, Brazil, all these different places that are part of this national or international movement to have a discussion about reparations. And actually in 2001, in Durban, South Africa, there was a conference which talked about racism. And one of the things that they brought up was this idea of having reparations become something that's studied, discussed, and finding ways to provide those reparations for people. There have been instances where blacks have been given reparations for a variety of different things. One of these, I don't know if you guys have seen the movie Rosewood. It was a small town in Florida. They made a movie about it. It wasn't a very good movie, I don't think. It was very inaccurate. But those people who were killed, who were run off of their land, they were actually given a small amount of restitution for that many, many years later. A very small amount of money, but they gave them something at least. And so reparations is not something new. It's been talked about for basically about 200 years in America. And so I think it's a worthy cause. There's a man by the name of Randall Robinson wrote a book called The Debt. Very, very good book, The Debt by Randall Robinson. And he actually makes the case for reparations in this book. He does a very, very good job of looking at it from a historical perspective and looking at the value of all of this lost labor, all of the psychological damage and all of those things. And so that's a very good book to read if you want to learn more about what the people that are fighting for reparations are actually talking about. That's a very, very good resource, I believe. We have any other questions from anyone? Okay.
When you're presenting, because you present some radical things that are very new to people.
May I have your attention, please? The library will be closing promptly at 8 o'clock. If you have material to check out or print checks to pick up, please do so now. Internet terminals will shut down at 7:55. Thank you.
I partially asked this question. I mentioned to you on Sunday. I was actually presenting at a church about Jesus, but I realized after talking to you just today that I actually incorporated something I learned from you. I was just talking about the lionization of people, and I incorporated that, Lincoln, the great emancipator, freed the slaves, that he was a white supremacist, and there's lots of documents, saying so, and written in his own hand. And I learned that from a presentation you had given. And I realized in retrospect that I was afraid to bring up that information, afraid of what the reaction would be. Obviously we saw somebody here today, really got stirred and upset over what you're discussing.
Right.
How often when you're presenting do you have to encounter big challenges like that?
I think out of all of the years I've been doing these presentations, and I started doing them in 2003, I think that's only the second time this happened to me. In a lot of cases, the people that I'm talking to, the people that come to my presentations, I would assume they would know what I'm going to be talking about. It's not as if I didn't advertise exactly what I was talking about, and I would assume that they would come to get that particular information. And this is one of the things that I always say is that there's this issue of an understanding of American history. And we're all over the place as Americans in terms of our true understanding of our history, because we're not taught these things in school very often. Mm-hmm. And so for a lot of people, there's a spectrum. So there's some people down here that know very little, and these things are very, very difficult for them to deal because they don't believe those things. And then there are people on the other end of the spectrum that know these things very well from things that they've learned during their education or lived experiences. And there are people all in between. And so I realize that when I do these presentations that I have to do the presentations for people along the entire spectrum. And so when I draw up my descriptions of what I'm going to talk about, I try to be as honest about it as possible so that you're not going to come and be surprised by anything I say. I'm not a person, and Hibby and Jerry Ann can tell you this, they've been knowing me for years, that I'm not a person that's going to be dishonest about this history and try to, make people feel comfortable about it. That's not my job to make you feel comfortable about it. And I understand the perspective that the woman had. We just celebrated the 4th of July, and people are celebrating this wonderful country they live in. And I understand that. And I don't have an issue with that. Me personally, I don't celebrate the 4th of July. And I stopped celebrating the 4th of July many years ago when I read something that Frederick Douglass, he didn't write it, but there's a speech he gave called "What to the Slave is the 4th of July." And I read that speech and I'm like, he's making a darn good point. What the heck are black people celebrating on the 4th of July when a majority of blacks in this country were not given their freedom? The English settlers in the colonies gained their freedom from the British tyrant, as they called him. But they still enslaved millions of black people at that time. The Declaration of Independence said all men are created equal, but he wasn't talking about black people. Thomas Jefferson owned black people. George Washington owned black people. A majority of the first 20 U.S. presidents owned black people. So for us, and believe me, I saw plenty of black people celebrating the 4th of July. My brother is a big patriot and celebrates the Fourth, but I just have a different view on it. I tell people I know too much about our history for me to celebrate it honestly. And I can remember years ago that this man who lived down the street from me came, and he was being very patriotic, and he was putting flags in everyone's yards, you know, just trying to be a good citizen. And he came, and I said, I don't want any of the flags in my yard. He says, well, why not? I said, I just don't want any. I said, you can put them wherever you want. Just please don't put it in my yard. And so I went in the house. When I came back out, he was putting the flags in my yard. And I was like, dude, did I not tell you to not put the flags in my yard? He says, well, I'm just trying to be patriotic. I said, I don't mind you being patriotic. I said, don't put the flags in my yard, and then you put them in there anyway. So I picked up one of them and I snapped it. I said, now take this flag and do something with it. That's how mad I was, because to me, that was him being very disrespectful to me. Now, some people look at me and say, oh, you're not patriotic and blah, blah, blah. Listen, I served 6 years in the Navy, risking my life overseas for the freedoms that we have. So nobody can challenge my level of patriotism. But my level of patriotism, I look at a true patriot is a person who challenges the society they live in. That's what the founding fathers did. They challenged the society to live in. In fact, Thomas Jefferson said that we're going to need a good revolution every now and then to make sure that we maintain the freedoms that we have. Yet, we've never had that, truly. So, I understand what the woman was trying to say. I just think that she misinterprets what I was trying to say. I think that maybe she was expecting something different than what I was talking about. But I don't have any issue with that. I used to get challenged by people at the Black Holocaust Museum regularly about this history. But I don't have an issue with it. It doesn't bother me. I mean, it gets me a little hyped, obviously. But I don't have an issue with it. I'm not mad at her or anything like that. That's why I invited her to come back. And the guy thought I was being condescending, but I was honest. Come back. I mean, if you have an issue, come back. Watch some more of my presentations. Talk to me. Don't just get mad and walk out because you disagree with me. I always believe what Dr. King said. We can disagree without being disagreeable.